Webinars about fact-checking leadership assessments, why results sometimes don't match the reality. And Michelle and I are very excited about this topic in particular because we have a lot of conversations with our wonderful clients and partners from all around the world. We might have a slight delay today because we're connecting from different continents. Michelle is based today in Denver. I am in Bratislava in Slovakia. So there might be just a little bit of a delay that we'll have to manage. So if we are jumping into each other's points or trying to cut somebody off, it's not what we're intending to do. It's just the technology. A few housekeeping things today. If you do have questions or comments that you'd like to share, please make sure that you type them either as chat or in the Q&A portion of the webinar technology. We also have a couple polls today that we will share with you, so please do give us your opinion and vote. It's always very interesting to see how what we are seeing with some of our clients is then reflected in your organizations. And last but not least, we are recording today's session. So if some of your colleagues missed it, or if you find it valuable and you'd like to share it with some of your colleagues, we will make the link available. So with that, let's do some quick introductions, especially for those of you who are new to Pinsight or who have not met Michelle and I. I'll go first. My name is Martin Lanik. I'm the founder and CEO at Pinsight. Founded this company about 12 years ago now. And my background is in industrial organizational psychology. So I'm going to be playing the role of the scientist today and bring some of the research evidence to the discussion. And with me today is Michelle Brown, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Thanks, Martin. Hey, everyone. It's lovely to see so many familiar names and faces coming into our participant group today. And for those that are new, it's very nice to meet you. My name is Michelle Brown. I'm the COO, and I'll be playing the role of the practitioner in today's discussion. My background is in clinical psychology, but also in business. And as my role as the COO, I like to think that I'm the customer orientations officer, and I spend a lot of time with our customers and making sure that our assessment tools are working for them and serving their strategic talent needs. That is my day job. In the nighttime, I'm also a teacher at University of Denver in our MBA program on organizational behavior and leadership. But for today's session, we're really focusing on something that I think, as Martin said, we spend a lot of time talking about, and that is the combination of reality and assessment results. And I can see so many familiar names on our participant list today that we've had conversations together saying, oh, surprising assessment result came back for this person, or wasn't quite expecting this when I saw the results. And that was really what led to this discussion about this, what we call the I know Joe problem. So what are we going to talk about today? And I think, like I mentioned, we've all experienced results that have surprised us. Maybe your favorite candidate who interviewed so well just blew it in the assessment, or maybe a rising star employee who you've known for years has been massively outshined in an assessment by a newbie whose name I can't remember. So how is that possible? And should leadership assessments and assessments in general be trusted? Should we take the results as fact or fiction? Best practice tells us that important decisions like who to hire, when to promote, and how to develop leaders should be based on objective data. That's the responsible and ethical thing to do. But leaders are often skeptical about assessments because the results don't always match their reality. At best, some business leaders think that assessments are just maybe nice to haves, and at worst, maybe business leaders think assessments are like horoscopes and they just tell them what people want to hear. What we also know is that often people get these results back and they feel like the assessment results are incorrect because they know Joe. And that's really what we're talking about today. When an assessment report might contradict what's seen on a candidate's resume, or who we experience in an interview, or who we know every day at work. And so in today's webinar, over the course of just this very small 1 hour, we're going to explore the main reasons why assessment results might differ from what we see in real life, how to understand that discrepancy, and then what to do in each decision, ultimately to make the best possible hiring, promotion, or development decision at hand. So we'll work in these 3 chapters. As Martin said, we are all here today because we're all passionate about this topic. We will certainly be making time for questions. I think you have a Q&A box at the top there, which we'll make time for at the end as well. But I also know that this won't be the end of this conversation. So let's jump in. For those that don't know us, Pinsight's main mission is to bring fairness to leadership selection, leadership development, and succession. We believe it's important to have a level playing field for all aspiring leaders to be able to show what they can do, to unlock their potential, and to be evaluated with a really clear and objective criteria so that we can have the best leaders in positions to make the most advantageous impact on businesses, organizations, governments, and society at large. The way that we do that to fulfill that mission is by building assessment and development technology that can help organizations use assessments in a cost-effective and scalable, but also very high-powered way. So we specialize in leader selection, leadership development, and succession planning by using an assessment center methodology, also by using assessment results to build bespoke development plans, and to use that great data to inform business leaders about how to make a range of talent decisions by providing a talent analytics platform as well. But more time for that later. Let's get into today's topic, which is what we're all here for. So this is the I know Joe problem. Now, we've been calling it the I know Joe problem or the I know John problem well before the election started many, many years ago. So this isn't a political statement at all, but it's certainly, there's a lot of evidence out there, or media out there about I know Joe. What we're really talking about here is about that experience of our judgments versus objective accuracy. And interestingly, research about confidence in judgments, we see that the research shows that confidence systematically exceeds accuracy, implying that people are much more sure than they are correct. I have a personal experience about that, and we have a little joke in our household when I'm making absolute certain that the shop that we're looking for is to the left. And my husband frequently makes the joke, I'm Michelle Brown, always certain, sometimes correct. This is partially the I know Joe problem. What we know here is that the key finding in confidence research is that confidence exceeds accuracy so long as the person answering hard questions about unfamiliar topics. So for example, in a spelling task, when people were correct about 80% of the time, they often claimed to be 100% certain. Put another way, error rates around confidence versus accuracy is about 20%, when people expect the error rate to be 0. But in selection or people decisions, we rarely evaluate our confidence, but we make declarations of certainty and then are surprised or reject evidence to the contrary. Basically, in layman's terms, the I know Joe problem is the misplaced confidence we have in our perception about other people. It's that certainty we have about their characteristics, about their performance or their capabilities or their potentials that come from our own experiences of the world. And the reason that this is a problem is that when we think, I know Joe, we're often more confident than we are accurate. So this is where assessment has a role to play. So then let's ask this question. This is where our first poll is going to jump in. When do you feel like maybe you are 100% certain that you know Joe, but maybe you're open to an assessment? You know, how often are you using assessments in your own organizations? Brandon Hall suggests that while most employers use assessments in some manner, only about 20% of organizations have some formal strategy that leverages assessments in some sort of pre-hire to departure capacity. So let's hear from you here. I'm going to post a poll in a moment. In your organizations, where is the path, or where is the place where you most often use assessments to inform decision making? Is it at the point of hiring decisions, at the point of making important promotion decisions? Is it in succession planning and who you are getting ready or placing in a high potential or succession plan to help them get ready to the next level? Is it in development, just simply to give people insight that they can then take advantage of, or never? So in your own organizations, when is it that you are using assessments? So here we go. And let's launch the assessment, the poll here. So you should be seeing a poll in front of you. When are you most often using assessments? Hiring, promotion, getting the next generation of leaders ready, in development, or for simply insight purposes, or never. What I can see already as we've got some people filling in these results is that we have a group of us that are already dedicated to an assessment methodology. Fortunately, no one is scoring never, so we are amongst good company here that I think we are all on the assessment boat. How we're using it is a little bit different. Give a couple more seconds here for a few more people to finish their response. And then I'll discuss the results. All right, so interestingly, more than Brandon Hall suggests, about only 20% of organizations having a formal strategy. For the group that we have with us today, there's about 40% of folks that are using assessments to inform those hiring decisions, about 40% that are using it to as part of their development program, and then a little under 15% of folks are using it to inform who's getting the promotion, but a very small number of people using it for succession planning. So predominantly, folks are certainly using it for hiring or development purposes, with just a hair over 40% of using it for hiring, which is fantastic. But it does mean, therefore, that we really need to think about assessments and how to use assessments to manage the I know Joe problem. So this is where I hand to Martin. Martin, if people are using assessments to help with assessment decisions or for insight purposes and development purposes, can assessments be trusted? What should we do with the results?
Yes, great question. And looking at the poll results, I had that immediate experience of I know Joe. Because when you think about it in a hiring context, you don't really know Joe. So of course, that's when we are much more likely to use assessment. In development, when you are deciding whether you want to invest some good resources in the person's growth, then maybe that's when you are more open to a more objective, more accurate type of data. But interestingly enough, in the cases when you really feel like you know Joe, so when it comes to promotion decisions, when it comes to succession decisions of who you identify as your next generation of leaders, that's when we really maybe see that. And I wonder if the poll results are just confirming that. But let's get to this question of trusting assessment. So we can answer this question from two perspectives. So when we question whether we can trust assessments, leadership assessments in this case, we would be looking first at the reliability. So we want to understand, well, how much error is in the measurement. And then the second way to answer that question is from the perspective of what we call validity. So that helps us to understand how well does the assessment actually predict some outcomes of interest. So let's start with the notion of reliability. Reliability refers to the amount of error in the measurement. In fields like physics, we do achieve or see perfect measurement, which means that there is no error. An example would be if I ask 100 people to measure a letter-sized sheet of paper, they're all going to agree that the measurement is the same. It's 8.5 by 11 inches. Done, right? There's perfect measurement. There's very little room for error. You take the ruler, you make the measurements, and 100 people are going to arrive at very, very closely the same type of information. But we're not physics. We are in the field of psychology. And as you'll see on the next slide, measuring people is not perfect. If I were to ask 100 people to evaluate you, I'm going to get some very different responses. And I can guarantee that those 100 people are not going to agree on their evaluation of you. And I think that's really the point, because then the next question is, we know that there is error and there is inherent error in measurement and measuring people. The next question is then, well, how big is that error? And I put some data here for comparison. So we see that with leadership assessments, we get anywhere around 20-25% of error rate, which means that if you took the same assessment 100 times, you would get the same score about 75% of the time. But then compare that with some other metrics that we usually use to make decisions based on. So performance reviews, for instance, we see that there is a 48% error rate, which means that if 100 managers evaluated you, only 52 of them would actually agree. The other 48% of that data is going to be job interviews, especially unstructured job interviews. The error rate is even higher. So if you were interviewed by 100 people, only 44 of those would actually agree. The 66% would be an error. So in essence, these judgments or human judgments that we see in performance reviews, we see in interviews, they tend to be no better than a coin flip, even though all these managers and interviewers are 100% certain that they are correct in their judgment. So the point is that, yes, there is error in measurement. And we see that with assessments, at least we can understand the level of error through decades of research. But with human judgment, that's very difficult for us to do. And we know that a human judgment is full of error, and part of that error is actually bias. And that's when we see that unconscious bias creeps into these evaluations. And this unconscious bias, especially when you're evaluating leadership, for instance, it can creep in and it can color our evaluation of others. So for instance, we know that from our recent study that managers are 3 times more likely to identify men as having leadership potential than women, and white men 2 times more likely to be identified as having leadership potential than black men. So as a result, we see this high error in judgment, and that results in people not being evaluated based on merit, but rather they are being evaluated based on irrelevant characteristics now, like gender and race, and that is what's increasing the error rate, unfortunately. So that's the reliability perspective. Now we can look at assessments from the perspective of validity. And again, I'm going to use assessments in comparison to managerial ratings of performance and then interviews, just so that we can put it into perspective. The thing to remember is that if you have a lot of error in measurement, the data that you get is actually, or a big portion of the data that you get is irrelevant to the actual skill of the employee. You're picking up on things like gender and ethnicity and whatnot, other irrelevant factors that are probably not going to matter at the end of the day in terms of performance. So when you measure irrelevant characteristics, that is random error. And it's very difficult for this error to predict anything meaningful, because the error in and of itself is not meaningful to the job or the position. For example, if you were interviewed by 100 people and only 44 of them agree on your strengths, your development needs, should you really be making a hiring decision based on that? How often do we track the judgment of individual managers to see how accurate their predictions are? No, we don't do that. We just take their certainty and we trust that since they're certain, they are actually accurate. But unlike judgments, assessments do undergo decades of scientific research to determine their accuracy. And we know the error rate, we know the validity, and you can see that in this graph right here. You can see that with leadership assessments, for instance, we are getting the type of predictive power that you see in medicine. For instance, it's very similar to the relationship between smoking and lung cancer. And we all trust and believe that, yes, if you smoke, it's going to lead to lung cancer. And similarly, then we should be trusting leadership assessments based on this data, because we know that those who do well on leadership assessments tend to be more engaged, they are more likely to meet targets in their job, they receive higher performance evaluations, they advance faster in the organization to bigger roles, they tend to stay longer in the company, there's less turnover. If they're in leadership positions, they tend to retain their team members for longer, and they also enjoy teams who are more engaged. So overall, these assessments do a better job at predicting outcomes of interest than other forms of data that we use or tend to use in promotion and performance reviews or to make hiring decisions. So how often do we take the judgments of individual managers and track them over time to see how accurate their predictions where we don't scrutinize managers the same way that we actually scrutinize assessments? Unlike judgments that we get from management, from interviewers, assessments actually undergo decades of that scientific research before they become so-called certified. Your managers and your interviewers and recruiters, they do not come with a technical manual. So you don't know what the error rate is. You don't know how predictive or how good their judgment is actually in prediction, because it's just not feasible to track them over time. But we do know that assessments on average tend to have lower error rates than humans, and assessments need to prove that they actually predict future outcomes through scientific research, and the good ones actually do that. So assessments do a fairly good job of predicting, definitely better than humans can. But knowing that there's actually more error in the human judgment, we are not always so open to the assessment. And I would like to pose a question to you now in the poll, just to see if you do use assessments in your organization, how likely is management to base their decision on the assessment results? Are they very likely to take that assessment and say, yes, I'm using this piece of data to make this decision? About as likely as not, are they unlikely or very unlikely? So let's launch that poll. Thank you, Michelle. And I wonder where we are going to end up here. This is usually a mixed pot, where sometimes the management uses this data, sometimes they don't. And next we'll explore perhaps why that is. All right, people are still voting. We have a lot of assessment fans here. This definitely is looking skewed.
These are our people, Martin.
Yes, indeed. All right. Seems like everybody's done voting. Okay, so let's close the poll. And it looks like the winner is likely. So 48% of you voted that management is likely to base their decision on the assessment results, which is great. I think we see that 15% are saying that they're very likely, and we are seeing 37% who say about as likely as not. Fortunately, in this group, we did not have anybody who selected the negative ends of very unlikely or think what this tells us is that there is a bit of cautiousness that I'm reading in these poll results. That yes, there is a favorable view, but I'm not seeing an overwhelmingly high response where the management is just jumping to conclusions after they see the assessment results. Michelle, do you have a perspective of perhaps why that can be?
Well, I think that we are certainly polling a group of people who are our people here. And I think that we would certainly see perhaps some very different results when it comes to the general population or the general population of organizations. And I certainly know by our attendee list that we are singing to the choir, which is wonderful. I also think, though, that, there's still a group of people out there that are saying, they're about as likely as not, a large group of folks that are as likely as not to make decisions based on assessment results as not. And it was around about just a hair under 40%, which means that there's a good portion of people that are looking at assessment results and saying, and popping it in the trash. But I think, if there's something to take from your previous discussion there, Martin, is that there is something to be paying attention to assessment results. For those that have had an assessment on themselves, any variety of assessment, I think that also reinforces to each of us that have looked at our own results coming back, and the temptation is to maybe pull it out of the trash and just take another look and to see that, okay, there may be some error, but there's also likely to be some good information in there about the type of measurement that it is going to predict outcomes, and there's something worth listening to in assessment results. And I think that this is really where we want to take the conversation next into, if you are working in a population where maybe there's some skepticism about results, or maybe you have had skepticism about the results of your own assessment or the results of others. What should we do about that? In my work as practitioner, this is something I absolutely confront and have conversations with just about every day with someone. When there's some sort of result that comes back where we weren't really quite expecting, results might be surprisingly high or maybe surprisingly low. Characteristic patterns of personality don't match quite what we see at work, or there was some sort of expectation of skill that maybe didn't come up or shine through on the assessment. So this is where we're going to turn to what we think are the top 6 reasons why assessments don't match our reality. And reality in air quotes there, or inverted commas there, because we know that our reality is shattered with so much error for a variety of reasons, which is the topic for another day. So let's jump in. We're going to have a look at the problem and then what to do about it. The first problem. What's the first way that we understand why there's a big difference between results and reality?
The first problem is really the differences in definitions and what we mean by different terms. Assessments tend to be very precise with very narrow definitions. So when we use a particular term like communication, we have a very clear definition that is very tight and very narrow. In everyday language, we use these terms more loosely, and it could often happen that we use the same word, but we end up meaning 2 very different things. For example, you could say Jane doesn't communicate well, but what you mean by that is perhaps that she doesn't give you the information that you need, so she's not managing up. Maybe it means that she speaks too quietly and is not charismatic or shy. Maybe you mean that she rambles on and it's very difficult to follow her key points and you get lost in the message. Maybe it's that she's not listening well, or maybe that she's not a good presenter. That all can be just captured in the simple statement of Jane doesn't communicate well. In an assessment, we have a very tight and very narrow definition that is probably one of those and tiny part of that big general statement.
Absolutely. And so how do you resolve this? This is probably one of the most common issues that we confront when looking at an assessment results and then someone having a different experience of a candidate. The first thing that practitioners can do and assessment result reviewers can do is to get really clear on the definitions and the terms that we're thinking about before the assessment, but then also in reviewing the results. So best practice would tell us that when we are looking at an assessment, designing an assessment, looking at the criteria or the factors that we're measuring in an assessment, is to get very clear first on what exactly do we want to measure. So if a hiring manager comes to you and say, well, it's very important that someone needs to communicate well to be successful into this role, it's quite easy for me as an assessment practitioner to say, okay, I'm going to check off that we're going to measure communicating clearly. What should be most important for me then is to stop and ask my hiring manager or the person that's looking for the results to say, well, what do you mean by communicating well? Can you describe for me what that would look like when this person is communicating well? How would you know if they weren't communicating well? And look for them to be able to give you clear definitions, clear examples, as well as really try to narrow down what that criteria is. And you might discover, as Martin says, that when they're saying communicating well, they're really talking about presentation skills, or they might be talking about interpersonal skills, or some other facet of communication that perhaps isn't quite captured in what the assessment is measuring. That same conversation should happen when you're doing an assessment debrief to make sure the criteria and the definition is clearly spelled out. So when someone, quickly glances at a result and says, oh, I'm so surprised they scored well on communicating because they're terrible here at work. Well, what do you mean? Tell me what you mean by terrible. Because what I'm measuring is their ability to compose a well-organized message that consists of a few key points in written and verbal settings. That's my definition, and they did quite well. What are you talking about when you say you're surprised that they didn't communicate? So clarifying the definition as a practitioner, as an interpreter, is really important to help break down that misunderstanding of, are we talking about the same thing here? So that's the top reason, misunderstandings or mismatches of definitions of what exactly that we are thinking about when we say the same words. Here's the second one, personality coloring perception. Martin.
Yes, thank you. We, especially when our skills and our personality is really strong, so we are on either the really high or really low end, that is going to change the way we experience others. Me, for instance, I'm a highly organized individual, so I score on the 99th percentile on conscientiousness, which means that even the average person seems utterly disorganized. That's the filter I'm using. On the other end of the spectrum, if somebody was very low on conscientiousness, even the average person seems highly organized and structured and controlling to them. So what's inside of us, our traits and our skills, are coloring how we are evaluating others. And that can always determine, or that determines then what we are using as a comparison. If we are only using us as a comparison, we are going to experience people differently than when you compare them to a global norm group of thousands of individuals.
And so this really speaks to the solution here. When somebody says, oh, that person is high or low or good or bad, the question we always need to stop and ask is, compared to what? Because assessment results or assessments typically are built on global norm groups or benchmark samples of various populations. Whereas our judgments about them or ourselves are based on our unique experience of the study of n equals 1. My experience of what it is to be well-planned and organized is quite different from what well-planned and organized might look like in a global benchmark. I personally had that experience of getting my own assessment results coming back after 11 years of working in a consulting agency. Now, compared to everybody else in that consulting agency, we all had very similar sets of skills. When I compared myself to my team members, we all operated at a very, for example, high level of customer awareness. But that was just normal. If you had asked me how I was doing in that particular skill set, I would have said, about average. But put me in an assessment and compare me to a group of global leaders well above average from the usual. Similarly, when looking at some other skills, I might have been a bit of a shining star in that. that group. But, when I look around my team, I was the one that was tapped to do some very particular projects because I was the best there was. So as I walk into my interview, I tell them somewhat that I'm very high, I have excellent skills in this area, only to find out on the assessment results, well, you compared to every other leader in the globe, about the same. So it's really important when you're hearing yourself or a hiring manager or someone saying, I expected them to be higher, I expected them to be lower, or I'm surprised they did so well, I'm surprised they did so poorly. Compared to what? Compared to your own personality, compared to your own set of skills, compared to the industry norm, compared to the team they're operating in, compared to their experience, or compared to thousands of leaders around the globe in various organizations. That's the key question here. And so it's important to stop and ask that question of compared to what, but also as perhaps an interpreter of assessment results, either being a hiring manager or being in the role of interpreting results, also important for you to maybe take your own assessment and come with some insights so that you know when it looks like someone is an absolute train wreck, that's coming from the perception of being on the 99th percentile of being highly organized, or in my instance, being on the 99th percentile of extroverted, which means that everyone else around me is like as quiet as a mouse. So that's the second reason why the reality versus the results might differ, because of the comparison or the referent. Let's look at the third reason why there might be a difference in the reality versus the results. Martin.
Yes, we know that every individual has some strengths and some developments. There's the perfection of a perfect candidate for a job or for a position just doesn't exist. That's a myth. That person has not been born yet. But people often, or some people I should say, have these wonderful characteristics. So they are just so good at one particular area that it overshadows everything else. And you see this oftentimes in an interview when you have a very charismatic candidate that interviews just so well, and they make such a strong first impression in the interview. And you assume that this level of charisma and excitement is actually going to translate into a strong job performance, that everybody is just going to love this person. And then you put them through an assessment, and all of a sudden, your best favorite candidate is bombing the assessment, and you are surprised. So, what do you do about that?
Well, this exact phenomena has happened for many of our customers. And I can think of one very specific case where in the process of hiring a senior executive into the C-suite, my client came to me, Martin, and said, I think we found him. Everybody loved him. He was just fantastic. We all just felt so confident. We all just felt great about this candidate. And I said, great, excellent. Can't wait to see their results on the assessment. That's really going to show up their skills. It sounds like they're going to be extraordinarily well-rounded. And let's take a look. You can be absolutely sure that this person was very compelling in personality, very dynamic, very warm, very ambitious in their personality. But interestingly, they scored on the 95th percentile for executive disposition. The skills of using metaphor and emotive language and drawing people in with a compelling vision. But every other skill that was required to execute at that C-suite level was at the 50th percentile or lower. What that was really shocking to come back to the client to say, certainly has the executive presence, certainly has the charisma. Absolutely, this person up in front of a room and being able to bring people along looks like an executive. Can they perform the work that you need them to do, though, is going to be the other decision that we need to make. And this is where the advice to them was to say, let's really be quite rigorous in evaluating the criteria of what we need to have this person possess in terms of their skills and abilities to execute the role. It is wonderful that you all loved him and thought he was terrific and very commanding of a room. Can he, however, take advantages of entrepreneurial opportunities? Can he take ambiguous information, form it to strategy? Does he have the financial acumen, the business acumen to interpret multiple facets of the business? The results would suggest no. And so the advice that I gave back to this organization was to really create a very clear criteria, make sure we were operating a criteria, and write down the pros and cons and have a look at this person in terms of the weightings of how much did it, how important was it for them that they command a room and have executive presence versus was there more important things going on inside the organization that we really needed to consider before we made that hiring decision into this role. So it's the third reason is there a particularly loud or overshadowing skill that might be masking some other skills? I've also seen this in promotion and high potential evaluation, where someone is particularly strong at influencing others, but to the outside world, it looks like executing and getting work done. It's not, it's influencing skills, but because they're so effective on getting projects done, the evaluations of the performance is actually misbalanced. There is other skills that are influencing other ones, giving some false reads on how people are doing their work and not necessarily tapping what's going on in reality. So let's go to number 4, the top 6 reasons why we might have a difference. Martin.
Well, sometimes it is the company culture that is not encouraging a particular behavior. And I think this is what you see, especially when the score is surprisingly high, where you see a really high score, a skill on the assessment, and you say, well, how come this person scores so high on planning and organizing or active listening or influence initiative, where I never see this on the job? The answer is that in those cases, probably the team culture or the company culture may not be encouraging that particular behavior. For instance, you could have an organization that is highly caring, where it is these emotive, supportive type of behaviors that are valued. So showing drive and showing initiative, even though it is not a great degree of initiative or drive, could be seen as aggression, as going against the will of the group, as interrupting this flow of positive energy and this caring nature. So always think of how is the company culture, the team culture influencing this behavior, and is it allowing it, encouraging it, or is it shutting it down?
And this is exactly an exact example of a customer conversation that I had not so long ago, where senior manager had selected a couple of successes. They're very confident in this, or these few folks that were rising stars inside the organization. They completed the assessment, but the scores on planning and organizing in this instance were not as strong as they were expecting. And this was a bit of a head scratcher. And they were saying, they were concerned that it just feels like all of our young talent, all of our rising stars are low on planning and organizing and getting things done. What's going on? And so this is where we went back to the data. And this is where it is really useful to have an assessment that can give you multiple data sources and be able to provide you with group views of what's going on. Because when we took this whole cohort, when we took a large group of the organization, we could very quickly see that there was capability and ability for planning and organizing skills to be expressed. When we looked at the correlation of, what, the current level of performance on a skill like planning and organizing and the alignment to the personalities was very much there. But the other thing that we saw was when we amalgamated and put all of the scores together for the general population in terms of personality, we could see that the average personality for this organization was above the 90th percentile for caring. This was a group of people that were extremely warm, more warm, more friendly, more collegial, more loving, more compassionate, more empathic than the general population. And here was an entire organization, entire insurance company filled with folks that were deeply relationally oriented. And so this is where we said, I can see that you've identified these folks that are high potentials. You're concerned about some of these task management execution skills. It isn't so much that they don't have those skills. They have the potential to grow these skills, but the company culture relies on getting things done through relational avenues and being warm and caring and forgiving, as opposed to task execution, driving accountability, project management, which is what we're measuring when we're measuring, planning, and organizing. And so the solution here, particularly when we're evaluating results for folks that are in maybe high potential programs, succession programs, promotion decisions, when we're looking at folks that we know well, is we also want to think about the culture that they have existed in, that there is a larger context at play that might be suppressing skills being expressed or suppressing skills being practiced and reinforced and rewarded. And remember that leadership skills are just simply habits, sets of behaviors that we have established over time. And in the absence of encouragement or rewards for those behaviors can extinguish. So it might be that these abilities and capabilities and potential exist, but they have to be unlocked and fostered around the context and as well as around the work that people do. And that's what we're going to speak to next in the next of the opportunities to understand what's the difference between reality and results. Martin.
Great, and I'm looking at the clock here, and we have about 15 minutes left. So you can start thinking of your questions and putting them in the Q&A portion, or putting them as a chat, because we do want to save a few minutes at the end to address those. All right, so the next big problem that we see is that we don't always have a good opportunity to observe, and especially now when we're working virtually, we don't see the employees and our coworkers as much as we did before. So we might form an impression of somebody and somebody's skill set just based on the limited situations where we observe them. For example, if you've never seen an employee who have a highly emotional reaction when they are in a conflict situation with an upset customer, you might think that they're cool as a cucumber. You know, that this is somebody so even-tempered, they never get upset. And it's not, it's not true. It just means that you've never had the opportunity to observe them in that particular situation or behavior. So what's the solution for this problem, Michelle?
Well, I think this is a really common problem, particularly when we're evaluating people for promotion decisions, particularly that first step from frontline worker to first line manager. A classic challenge that we see is, good technical skills, but then challenges when they come to be evaluated in leadership. This is the most common conversation I would say that I have with people when they say, well, but they're an extremely strong sales performer, or they're great in the marketing department, or well, they're extremely good with this technical set of skills. Yes, but let's make sure we understand what the assessment is measuring. Was the assessment measuring personality? Was it measuring learning aptitude? Was it measuring leadership skills? Was it measuring some other element? And if the assessment is not measuring exactly what's happening in the current role, then it's very hard to make a really clear distinction. This is a really, really classic one when we're making that decision to promote our best salespeople into sales leadership roles. And we have a sales leadership assessment, and it is very common when we make that assessment that people are surprised that their best salesperson isn't performing so well as a sales leader. And the reason is that they have observed this person negotiating, asking questions, having a strong customer orientation, active listening. But in a leadership role, now we need to understand and see what their skills are at motivating others, teaching, mentoring and coaching, having financial acumen, mentoring, an entirely different set of skills. that if we're making the distinction of you're making or trying to make a decision to say, well, you know, I'm trying to make the decision about whether to promote this great piano player over to the drums, and based on their piano performance, I think that they're going to be, you know, great at drums. This is a mismatch of expectations of what I see in their work and what I'm evaluating and the decisions that I'm making going forward. So it's important here to both check impressions with others, but also to make sure we're getting check impressions with other data sources, either by third-party evaluations or doing work samples, doing stretch assignments or temporary step-up assignments, so that we can actually really see them leading and not just guessing what they might be like in a leadership role based on their technical performance. Martin, sixth and final reason that we might have a difference.
Yes, this is our final reason why leadership assessment results might not match our reality, is that the person could indeed be relying on a strong team or set of resources. Whether it's a leader in a position relying on a very strong team, a very strong set of assistants, or an individual contributor that's relying on a whole company infrastructure, and that is what's making them effective. So in an assessment, you are removing the person from this context to get a read on their particular skill set. So although somebody might seem like having a very strong track record and they can actually be achieving results, and they can be achieving these great things, if you remove their team from them as an individual, they are not as effective.
And the key here really is to think about the individual's performance in their work and their previous success history in the context of the resources, the teams, and the organizational dynamic that they were in the past. So this challenge is something that we see most often in senior executive evaluations, where executives are used to working highly collaboratively with other executives, working very closely with their professional leaders and their directors, having strong resources around them to ensure that they are successful in the broader picture. Like Martin said, when we understand now where their natural skills are and where their weaknesses are. This isn't necessarily now a go or no-go decision. That assessments can now be informed to tell us much more about the resources, the team dynamics, and the skill fit that they are going to need to be successful in the future role in organizations, rather than using the results to say that this is a go or no-go. This tells us much, much more about how we build them for success so that they can continue a track record of success, and or with any assessment results, telling us about how the resources around them, both their colleagues and the team and support, is going to need to help fill their gaps. We don't believe necessarily in the perfect leader, the well-rounded leader, but rather the well-rounded team or the well-rounded organization that can put the right people in the right space for maximum performance. So again, context in so many of these instances matters, both the cultural context, the team context, the referent that we're making interpretations about. This all matters. But there are a couple of others here that we want to also acknowledge, reasons why the assessment results might feel off from what we were expecting. This can happen because we've got higher scores than we expected on a result, or lower scores. The first other reason might be engagement in the assessment and or the current role. So it is not uncommon for us to see someone either not really do their best effort in an assessment, if maybe they're not really that engaged or that interested in taking the promotion or getting the job, or perhaps they're a little disengaged at work, but they really enjoyed the assessment because they thought it was an opportunity for advancement. So disengaged at work, highly engaged in the assessment. Vice versa, not really interested in the promotion, but perceived to be a high performer as well. Another reason that we might see assessment results off is just simply testing effects, that it is not uncommon for some folks to have significant test anxiety, that as soon as they're in a testing environment, their anxiety rise, they have an amygdala hijack, very hard to concentrate and do well. So they might bomb the assessment because they're so overwhelmed. flip that with someone maybe taking a test for promotion reasons or hiring reasons, and they may really want to put their best foot forward and maybe overemphasize some positive characteristics, or maybe report themselves to be more conscientious than maybe they probably would have scored in a different circumstance. And then, of course, there is lack of preparation. That many assessments, particularly the ones that we do, require people to be dialed in, to prepare well, to do their best effort. If I roll up to it without any preparation, like the SATs, unlikely to go well. Does that absolutely reflect your abilities and capabilities? Probably not, but the lack of preparation for the test itself might have an impact. And then finally, Martin, testing error.
The testing error, and I think there is an overall agreement and understanding that yes, there is error in testing. We know that these assessments are not perfect, but I think the important thing to realize is that with any assessment, a good assessment that has the scientific evidence and comes with the technical manual, you know what the error rate is. And you also know how well that assessment predicts outcomes of interest. With humans, the error rate is high. And unfortunately, no matter how confident those humans are, they don't come with a technical manual. And we just don't know how big that error rate is. And we don't know how well they are actually predicting the different outcomes of interest. I'm looking at the time. We have about 4 minutes left, and I see all these wonderful questions coming. So please keep them coming in, and then we'll be addressing them in just a moment.
I'll do a quick summary and then we'll move to questions. So I think some of the things that we want to say is that when it comes to assessments, and if the results don't match the reality, don't trash the assessment results. There is some form of truth in there. We acknowledge that there's error, but there is still some form of truth. Things to remember about the I Know Joe problem is that some of the reasons that we can have a mismatch in the reality versus the results is that we perhaps don't necessarily have a shared criteria. So the advice here is to work on definitions of skills and potential and personality first before going into an assessment. Secondly, be cautious of comparison. So when somebody says, I expect them to do well, or I'm surprised they did so poorly, or this is a good score, or they're the best in the business, compared to what? That's the key question you want to always ask. What do you mean when you say communication? Good compared to what? And then finally, if you're operating in an organization that perhaps does not have an openness to assessments, focus on the business case rather than maybe the scientific validity, but bring outcome data that can tell people that with assessments, when decisions are based on assessments, we can really see that the evidence tells us that people are likely to perform better, be more engaged, retain their team longer, and be high performers, that we have a higher confidence of getting the right decision when we're using multiple data sources than just one. I know that we have not completely exhausted all of these pieces here, but Martin, it sounds like there's some good questions coming in for the group.
And I think the first one just speaks to what you just addressed. I'm going to read it off and then perhaps we can add something to it. If I'm not a decision maker, how can I encourage our management to buy into virtual assessment centers?
Well, I think that the answer there is certainly to focus on some of the business case of assessments. We want to talk about assessments as being a highly predictive and highly reliable tool, but used in a battery of methodology. In some industries, we would use it like the Swiss cheese model. The more layers of Swiss cheese you have, the less circles that you have seeing. Assessments are one way to really block out error. It's part of the battery, part of the decision-making data, rather than just the only decision-making, and it absolutely increases the likelihood of you getting the outcomes of interest. So using and looking for assessment tools that are validated for the reason that you are looking for. So looking for tools that are validated for hiring decisions, promotion decisions, and so on.
I'll take the next one. This is a science type of question. So what's needed to be sure we have as an accurate assessment as possible. What criteria would you use or check to validate a good assessment? Definitely look at the technical manual. So request the technical manual. Every good test publisher or testing provider will have a technical manual. In the technical manual, you want to be looking at three things. So first, you want to look at reliability. So what's the error of measurement in there? How much error does it contain? The lower the error, the better the assessment. Then you want to look at validity for the particular application where you want to use the assessment. So assessments like DISC, Myers-Briggs, absolutely wonderful for development, absolutely no fit for hiring or promotion decisions, as an example. So you want to make sure that the assessment is validated for the particular use that you want to employ. And thirdly, as Michelle mentioned, the Swiss cheese metaphor. Whenever you can have an assessment center, which means that you are measuring the candidate from multiple different perspectives. So you would have personality, some cognitive ability, learning agility, and then simulations and behavioral type of observations and measurement, the better the assessment is going to be, because the truth is somewhere always in the middle between all these different assessments.
Perfect.
Next question. Do you ever recommend retaking an assessment if the results don't align with expectations? Michelle, do you want to take this?
Oh, I'm going to say it depends. So I think you want to, first of all, understand why the results might not be fitting with expectations first. So I think you should run through the checklist of, is this a mismatch of definitions? What was I expecting in comparison to what? You know, was there significant test effects? And remember that the likelihood of there being an error is more likely to be in the judgment of the person saying that didn't fit my expectations. So if you were asking me the question, should I reevaluate my expectations if the assessment results are different? I'd say yes. Should you retake assessments? Not always. Now, if someone says to you that their computer blew up and their dog died and, you know, ran away and the sun was in their eyes and they had people from out of town all in the middle of the assessment, maybe you might say there's some, you know, some contextual factors where they weren't showing at their best. However, it is less likely that the new test results are going to differ that much. In certainly retest versions here, at Pinsight, we see very low, very minimal changes in results in a retest situation because of the high levels of validity. So I wouldn't necessarily suggest doing a retake of assessment. Now, if there is some confusion about the results, that's a different question. That's where I think you should go back to your test and your assessment vendor and say, help me understand what I'm seeing here, because maybe there's an aspect of these results I'm missing. Maybe there's an aspect or some more information that we need to gather. Go back to your test vendor, check your own expectations, but also maybe gather a third data source. So go back into an interview situation or do some sort of work sample rather than retaking the test that you've done.
Great.
Right.
Now, my high level of conscientiousness is picking up on the fact that it's 9:03 here in Slovakia in the evening, which means that we're 3 minutes over. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to launch the last poll, and we will still, if you want to, we will still be answering questions that are coming in. A little bit about the poll: we do value your feedback. If you would be so kind to offer us some feedback, whether you found the webinar valuable, that would be very helpful for us. Also, if you are new to Pinsight and would like to explore a bit more about our leadership assessment and development solutions, please do let us know and let us know whether you'd like us to contact you after the webinar, and we'll be happy to do that. All right, so we'll keep that poll running.
And I can take the last two questions. Yes, I think the second last question, someone making a request for the slides. The recording is absolutely available to you. I know who asked for the slides. I will get them to you. If anyone else needs these to help prepare business cases for their clients, please just do shoot us a note and we can get you the slides. I'm absolutely happy to share this information. The final question was team morale. I don't want to hurt people's feelings. Should I use assessments that perhaps might come back differently to what people expect? And I don't want anyone to be upset. I'm so pleased that we're talking about empathy and care for people in today's world. And one of the things that I think, one of the worst things that we can do for our employees is to not give them good quality information about how they're performing and how they're comparing. We want to think about, why would somebody be upset about an objective assessment results that gives them an opportunity to really showcase who they are, to demonstrate their sets of skills, to really speak about and tell you who they are as a personality, how they learn, how they experience the world. Why should that, or why would we assume that that would be an upsetting experience for people? I think it only becomes an upsetting experience for people if they have a misperception of who they are, or we have withheld information about their performance, or we have given them misinformation about how they are performing in an effort to make them feel better. Our philosophy, one of our core values at Pinsight, is in the nature of potential. That humans are in possession of great, massive wells of potential, that there is no such thing as a bad result or a poor result. It is just information about who you are and what capabilities lie ahead. But without good information and without good insight, it is very, very difficult for me to make those shifts, make those changes, shift my perception, and take action. We absolutely believe in growth mindset, that this information should just be used as information at a starting position and data about where you are today. We also very much believe that leadership skills is very much about just habits, like learning a different language or learning a musical instrument. These are skills that we can learn with deliberate and intentional practice. But if you tell me I just am a great leader in some sort of arbitrary sort of way of defining that, that doesn't help me really hone and practice the skills that I'm already good at. And it doesn't help me deliberately pay attention to the skills I can improve to be effective. So if we assume that all people want to be effective and understood and to be valued, we should really be thinking about assessments as a gift to them rather than something that's going to hurt their feelings. So that's sort of my perspective on this. Should be really viewed as an extremely helpful tool that provides people with rich insight to know how they can get where they want to go rather than hurting feelings. Martin, anything more to add to that one?
I think you just summarized it beautifully, and it really does speak to one of our core values, that there is some negative sense that comes with evaluation, right? But it's not a negative. This is a gift, and this is a wonderful experience when you get an opportunity to look into the mirror through and see yourself through the eyes of others and really get this objective type of data. It is really life changing. And as we hear from many participants, yes, sometimes it takes time because we're not ready necessarily to hear what we need to hear. But the beauty of humans is that we can change, and if there are things we don't like about ourselves, as I always say, well, how hard can it be? You just practice little exercises, and 66 days later, you have a new habit, and you just changed a little bit. So we have a very, very positive view on assessment.
Absolutely.
Well, that was our last question.
Sure was. And so I think this is where we say thank you, and thank you for joining us. Thank you for sticking with us for an extra couple of minutes. We are so pleased to be seeing you all. We hope you are all extremely well and healthy. Thank you for spending the afternoon with us, and we look forward to speaking and seeing with you all again in the future. There'll be more information, like we mentioned, on our platform. This video will be posted there, so we encourage you to review or share it. We also have our research paper on repairingtherung.com, so you can see some of the information and research that we've done on bias and judgment when it comes to using assessments versus judgment in identifying successes and high potentials. But we continue to publish new research and new content very often, so please don't be a stranger, and we hope to see you again next time. Thank you from me, and thanks from you, Martin.
Thank you.